All right, so we got a recording in progress now. So, well, welcome everybody. Sorry for all the confusion at the beginning of the class. But my name is Deffenbaugh, for those of you who are visiting us. And we've been looking at a section of the Old Testament that was written at a time between the Babylonian captivity, which was around 587 to 539 BCE, when the Jews were taken from Jerusalem and held captive in Babylon for about 50 years or so, and then allowed to return under an edict by King Cyrus. But in that 50-year period of time, because they were completely, disconnected from their temple had been destroyed, their landscape, their freedom to worship as they saw fit. They began to develop a different style of worship and a different understanding of who God was. And this really was the beginning of what we know today as Judaism. Up until this time, the practice of the Israelites in the temple was centered primarily around sacrifice. But when you have no temple at which you can sacrifice, then you have to kind of, come up with an alternative for that. And this is the beginning of what we know of as rabbinic Judaism. Instead of sacrificing on the altar of the temple, the new altar becomes the Torah. Reading the Torah, understanding it, having rabbis, teachers reflect on the Torah and its application for your individual life. And that becomes a new kind of sacrifice, right? I'm going to sacrifice my selfish will on the altar of the Torah. And that worked well for the Jews for a good 50 years. Then it comes time to go back to Jerusalem. What do? Well, we either go back to Jerusalem and expect to pick up where we left off, with the temple. We'll rebuild the temple. We'll go back to our sacrificial way of worship. Or we can also continue to worship in the same way we did as in Babylon. And there was a conflict. There was a disagreement as to what was the proper way to worship God. There were two schools of thought, you might say. One was what we might call a more universalizing attitude towards the world. And this is where we get into this tradition of literature called wisdom literature. Wisdom literature, which includes the book of Ecclesiastes, the Wisdom of Solomon, and the Apocrypha, Proverbs, some of the Psalms, Job, Song of Songs. We talked about this, but and then we'll go back to talking about it actually next week. But as our lectionary reading this week is going to focus on the book of Esther, I thought we would take this little detour, so to speak, and talk about some other intertestamental literature that's being written at the time. But let's just remind ourselves of what this idea of wisdom is all about. First of all, there's this notion that God's wisdom can be known by observing the created world, that we can know about the attributes of God. We can know about God's love for the world, about God's sense of order, of right, good, by observing the cosmos. And so you can see in Psalm 8, oh Lord, how majestic is your name in all the earth. What are human beings that you're mindful of us, but you've made us just a little lower than the angels. Human beings have the ability, by virtue of their being created in the image of God, to know God by observing the world. And this, even though it's 2,500 years or 2,300 years or so before the scientific revolution, this lays the groundwork for the worldview that would eventually lead to what we understand as the scientific revolution, trying to discern the laws of God in the universe and thereby know something about God. People like Sir Isaac Newton saw themselves as natural theologians doing that. Now later, other scientists would just put that aside and have no need for the hypothesis of God behind all of that. But this idea of wisdom pervading creation, very important for a new, more progressive Judaism that rises out of the Babylonian captivity. The other school of thought, and one that we'll talk a little bit about today, is might best be called the Deuteronomic theology. We go back to the temple, we continue to sacrifice to God, as it says in the Pentateuch, first 5 books of the Bible, the books of Moses, according to all of those prescriptions and proscriptions. We follow law and thereby please God, because the covenant is about following God's instruction. And here's the logic, it's very simple. We still see this logic today, right? And even in the Christian churches. If you do what's right, God will reward you. If you don't do what's right, God will punish you. But that doesn't make sense. Our observation tells us that that's a faulty law of the universe, isn't it? A lot of people out there doing what is not right, and they seem to be flourishing quite well. Thank you very much. So how do you address those kinds of problems? And this is where the wisdom tradition comes back and says, look, it's much more complicated than you're allowing it to be. God is not a simple automaton, a mechanism by which you push the right buttons, it responds this way, you push the wrong buttons, it responds this way. The mystery of God is much greater than we can fathom. So next week, when we talk about Ecclesiastes and the book of Job, that's going to be the theme that we're going to develop, the theme of theodicy. Why do bad things happen to good people? In a world created good by an omnipotent, all-powerful, good God. Something in that equation that doesn't match up, right? And I'll give you all the possibilities next week of the logical syllogism, which makes that completely unacceptable in terms of human logic. But today, I wanted to make sure that we go back, and we left off last time, and we talked about this idea of wisdom being in Proverbs 8, identified as a feminine aspect of God, who is with God in the beginning, who creates, God creates through this wisdom, and the presence of that wisdom is still in creation. We have a tendency to think of creation as a one-time, one-off event. I'll make sure nobody's trying to get in our class here. But creation is continuous in the Jewish tradition, in the wisdom tradition. There is a wisdom that moves creation forward, and that's the presence of God. So just let me remind you of this section that we read, and I want to jump forward and talk about how this gets changed in the Christian tradition. The Lord created me, wisdom. Chokmah is the Hebrew word, female, feminine. Sophia, the Greek word, sapientia being the Latin word, all of them feminine. The Lord created me at the beginning of his work, the first of his acts of long ago. Ages ago, I was set up at the first, before the beginning of the earth. When there were no depths, I was brought forth. There were no springs abounding with water. Before the mountains had been shaped, before the hills, I was brought forth. When he had not yet made the earth and the fields, or the world's first bits of soil, when he established the heavens, I was there. And it goes on, this song of creation, the song of
Where are you reading from?
Proverbs 8. Proverbs 8. What does this do to your brain? What are you thinking? I can tell you got something going on in your brain.
I was thinking, I don't remember it being quite that personified in the first person, but I just haven't read Proverbs 8 recently,
Well,
I guess.
I know, and this is the problem with our, we don't touch on these Old Testament texts.
Mhm.
But what happens to this? Got something happening with my Zoom here. So anyway, what happens to this? Let's say 500 years later, when the Christian church gets a hold of it, right? Because does this sound like anything that's similar to what we know? And of course, it's right up here.
Yeah.
John 1, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, the Word was God, and all things were created through him. Him, right? Logos, ha logos, it's a masculine, right? And so now we've been given in Christian theology this image of two guys, a couple of guys, creating the world through, this interaction of love between them. And it's the Word, ha logos, who's associated with Jesus, who is present in all of creation. And this puts us in connection with another tradition, a Greek philosophical tradition called Stoicism at the time, which believed that there is a kind of a logic to the created world. But that's quite different from what the Hebrews, the Jews, had talked about some time ago. This feminine presence in creation itself. And as we find, there is this kind of underlying misogyny, as we'll see even today, that runs throughout the Old Testament and even in the New Testament as well. But there are ways, if we could just teach about it, familiarize ourselves with it, that we can counter that, because misogyny is not necessarily the foundation upon which Jewish and Christian religion are built. Many feminist scholars, of course, disagree with that, but there are those who have, I'm trying to get out of this here, but there are those who've countered that as well. Let's move ahead. Any questions about the wisdom tradition? Last time we talked about some of the art that came out of the Song of Songs. Wisdom was a genre of literature written between 500 BCE and 100 of the Common Era. This was a time known as the Axial Age, when there was a lot of it's the foundational historical time period of our world's religions, all except for Islam. The time of the Buddha, the time of Confucius, the time of Lao Tzu, the time of Rabbinic Judaism, the time of Jesus, the time of Plato and Socrates, this time known as the Axial Age, when human consciousness across the world tended to take on a much more universalizing understanding of itself. I and the person from China share similarities that allow us to understand each other. But it also is a time when the individual starts to take precedence in religious life. It comes to be about not the community that you belong to. Think about Israel in the time of Moses. You were who you were by virtue of, I'm part of this community. God makes a covenant with the community of the Israelites. It is the 12 tribes of Israel that are in relationship with God. After the Babylonian captivity, after this axial age, or in the midst of this axial age, the focus starts to become one of, what are your individual responsibilities? We see this in Buddhism as well. Buddhism says, it's not about the organizations you belong to. All of those are stumbling blocks. Enlightenment is about what you are able to do yourself. We see this in Hinduism. We see it, Confucianism is a little different in this way, but it still has, Confucianism focuses on the community, but it still has an emphasis on individual responsibility. Individual responsibility becomes the primary driver of what makes a person right and good and religious in the world. So remember, we had these two schools of thought we talked about. In Judaism, there's the wisdom tradition, which is a very universalizing type of way of looking at the world. And then the Deuteronomic, which is a much more conservative idea that, hey, we need to go back to following the law. And this conservative group of people understood, in fact, we see the divisions of Judaism that derive from this time period even today. We have the Hasidic community here in Hastings, very much part of the Deuteronomic conservative movement. God gives us laws. By the time of Jesus, there were 619 laws of do this, don't do that, and if you just simply follow all of the laws, you will be blessed by God. But then there were other alternatives to this as well. But we see a community of Jews that after the Babylonian captivity really want to focus on prohibitions in the Torah. If we're going to maintain, remember, they're a community that had almost died out in Babylon. So they're really concerned about, hey, how are we going to exist? How are we going to continue in the world? Well, the one way we will do it is we'll build a wall around ourselves. I'm talking metaphorically here. And that wall would be the instruction or the Torah of God. And that law would prevent us from marrying outside of the faith. Because what happens when that takes place? Well, you become assimilated to another culture. We don't allow others to marry within the faith. Because what happens? Well, because they could undermine our whole faith network and whatnot. The emphasis here on not eating unclean foods. This is one of the biggest misconceptions in the Bible, is that God wants the Hebrews not to eat certain foods because of the health problems that they will cause. And it really has nothing to do with that. It has more to do with separating yourself from other cultures. These guys eat eels. These guys eat, but let's just look at lobster. You all like lobster, right? If you look at the order of creation, God creates things that swim through the ocean as well as crawl upon the ground. Hey, those are perfectly fine. You can eat those. If it is something that crawls upon the ground, it has to have a cloven hoof and chew the cud. So cows, perfectly fine. Pigs, cloven hoof, but they don't chew the cud, so unclean. It seems to make no sense to us. Think about lobster though. Does it swim through the ocean or does it crawl upon the ground? Well, it crawls upon the floor of the ocean. So it defies the order of creation, right? Therefore unclean. But the real impetus behind this had nothing to do with health reasons, but it had to do with affirming God's creation and affirming your role in that creation and not eating what others eat. That has the effect of, one of the ways we come to get to know each other, right, is have a meal with each other, sit down, and Jews at this time of the conservative bent did not want that to happen. I'm going to stop. Any questions or comments about this so far? Here's one I think you'll be really interested to know about: circumcision. There's no real evidence that circumcision was practiced before the Babylonian captivity. There are references in the Hebrew Bible and the Pentateuch to Moses being an uncircumcised Egyptian and things like that. But those things seem to have been edited in after the Babylonian captivity. Circumcision came to be a way by which you could identify yourself as part of this chosen community. And every time I say chosen, I need to add chosen not for privilege, but for responsibility. Responsibility in showing the world righteousness through following God's laws. So circumcision came to be practiced at this time. Exclusive worship of God. And we might say here, no idolatry. You don't want to, put yourself in any situation where you're going to be literally worshiping idols, wooden or brass or bronze or whatever types of idols that. And this was a very big one because that's the very first commandment. You shall have no other gods before me. Temple worship is the ideal. True worship of God happens only in a temple that is built on Mount Zion in Jerusalem. There are conservative Jews today, they're referred to as ultra-Orthodox, who still hold fast to this, right? We cannot truly be Jewish unless we can celebrate the Passover on the Temple Mount, sacrificing in a temple, you know, the way our ancestors did, the way we're required to do based upon, you know, the Pentateuch. We know, of course, the problem with that is that the Muslim Dome of the Rock sits precisely on the place where this temple sacrifice would take place. So it creates all kinds of very tragic political problems in Israel. But there are those who are uncompromising on this, right? We cannot truly be Jewish until that temple is built. Everything else is in place. We have our Jewish homeland established, and it's becoming bigger all the time. But until the hub of that wheel is completely greased, that is, until the temple sits at the center, we cannot be the Jews we are called to be. Not all Jews believe this, of course. There are Jewish movements that have tried to become modernized over time. You have, you know, the conservative Jewish movement. You have Reformed Jewish movement. There's a movement called Reconstructionist Judaism, something called Orthodox Judaism. But it's the ultra-Orthodox that are going to maintain this very, very strict adherence to the law. And all of this has to do with separating yourself from the Gentiles, you know. And it's a matter of self-preservation. It's not because they dislike the Gentiles, but the Jews at this time consider themselves still to be chosen, and they have the responsibility to follow God's laws. 619 of these laws. In order for a Gentile to be righteous, guess how many we have to follow? Just 7. Real easy ones. Don't kill people, don't steal, things like that. But it's the responsibility of the conservative, I should say, conservative small c, ultra-Orthodox Jewish community to be the righteousness of the world by following all the laws that God has established. This begins in Babylon. It is not exclusive. It's not the only Jewish movement, as you might imagine, but it is one that is starting to develop in this time period that we're talking about. Very, very fundamentalist, you might say. So some comments about that, or questions. That's just like a college classroom. Yeah, go ahead, Danny.
From a very practical point of view, to flip back to your comment about pork.
Yeah.
A lot of anthropologists really feel today that, you know, pigs were very, very destructive in desert climates.
Yeah.
And the oasis was so precious.
Yeah.
And what would pigs love, they can't sweat, you know, to get into the oasis and corrupt the whole fresh water supply.
Yeah, right.
And it's a sweet meat.
Yeah.
And therefore, they don't want people cultivating, they did not want people cultivating pigs for the purpose of human consumption.
Yeah, and it was a very urban type of animal as well. It could be kept. It eats everything, and it has no pigs, or they're despicable creatures. You know, they're about as dirty as you can get. You know, and we can talk about this after I can remember this woman's name, but she made this argument that it had nothing to do with the practicality. It had more to do with this need to define yourself by, you know, certain practices that would come to be known as kosher versus treif. Right. I can't remember her name right now. I should have thought of you being here. So, well, yeah, go ahead, Will.
This is a little off your pathway, but when you were talking about all the different branches of Judaism, I thought about, and Denny may be able to help with this too, have Native American tribes shown in North America shown any interest at all in any of these Jewish beliefs?
Such as what?
I don't
Jewish
know.
beliefs like
It just occurred to me. I've never read about any interest or participation. but
I don't
maybe
know.
there is.
I don't know. What would be the connection that you're seeing?
I don't know.
Yeah,
I don't get it.
yeah.
No,
Not that I know of.
Do you know, Danny?
I've
No,
never
okay.
seen it.
Yeah.
I haven't ever read about that.
And it wouldn't make sense, to me, because at least not in this, because Native American traditions tend to be much more open to ambiguity, right?
Oh, good.
And there's no ambiguity in this, right?
Good.
Absolutely no ambiguity. And it's in that ambiguity that Native Americans find the presence of mystery. Now, would they be much more open to the wisdom tradition? I think they're right in line with each other.
Okay.
Think of wisdom, if you will, as the stereotypical great spirit.
Yeah.
That's what we're talking about in the wisdom tradition. So we've got one group over here saying, hey, no, it's about the law. You just follow lockstep. That's how you make God pleased. The other one over here is saying, no, there's this great spirit that pervades the cosmos and it doesn't act according to human logic. And we need, as best we can, to conform our will to that great spirit. Very similar to Stoicism in that respect.
Thank you.
So you've got, let me see where I am now. Given this idea that, the emphasis comes to be on the individual as, as having moral agency, there comes to be a lot of legendary literature written at this time. We can look at the book of Daniel, we can look at the book of Esther, we can look at the book of Ruth, and we can look at the book of Jonah, and try to get us through as many of those as I can today. But let's just look at Daniel. For those of you who've been in the book, the Revelation class, you know that Daniel is really divided into two sections. One section contains this legendary literature that we're talking about, what we might call fables of righteousness, right? The other section, and it's a very clear demarcation beginning in chapter 7, these apocalyptic visions that Daniel has. The first section was probably older with the fables of righteousness. The second section probably came during the time of Antiochus Epiphanes, probably in the 2nd century BCE, where the Jews came to believe that the only hope for them was a Deus ex machina, God swooping down and taking care of their situation. But the early literature was written as a means of trying to impress upon children. Remember, you've got this small community, and trying to bring them up in the way of the Lord, so to speak. And so these are the stories that we know of Daniel as being the faithful paragon, right? Against the threat of idolatry. The worst thing you could do as a Jew in this, especially in this conservative community, was to go and worship other gods. And there were some really sexy gods out there. And when it came to worshiping other gods, sex was usually at the center of it. There are creation stories that talk about two gods coming together in union to create the world. And one wonders if this wisdom literature that talks about Sophia or Hakma, wisdom with God in the beginning, is a reflection of that kind of literature. But think the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The time is during the Babylonian captivity. King Nebuchadnezzar wants the Jews to worship him, or to at least worship the gods of the Babylonians. And that was the threat throughout the Babylonian captivity. And if they didn't, they would be thrown into these fiery furnaces. The story, they're thrown into the fiery furnaces, and there's an angel there that keeps them safe from the fire. We see something very similar to that as well in the story of, it's the same story told with a different context. Daniel thrown into the lion's den, right? Despite all of the threats to your life and to your faith and to your entire worldview, hold fast to this theology that leads you to follow the law that has been given by God. There are other possibilities out there, but remain true to that, to your faith tradition. Now, you know those stories pretty well, but I don't think you probably know about other additions to the book of Daniel. In the time period that we're talking about, because of Alexander the Great's conquest, there was a Greek Septuagint, Old Testament, that was written for those Jews living in Greek-speaking lands like Alexandria, Virginia, for example, Alexandria, Egypt. I don't know where that came from. Alexandria, Egypt, and it produced its own Greek Bible. So, but by this time, they took old Hebrew texts, translated them into Greek, but by this time there had been other texts that had been written. So stories were added to the original Hebrew text, and we see these in the book of Daniel. There are additions that are made to Daniel and in the book of Esther. But you might know about this story that I'm showing you, this painting by Artemisia Gentileschi, who was a early 17th century Italian painter, but she's female, one of the only female painters of the time that we, that has, well, we don't know, but certainly she has, prevailed up until the 21st century. But interestingly, Gentileschi has got so many paintings, so many versions of this painting, it's almost become her calling card. And the painting is the story of Susanna and the elders. Do you know the story? This is one of the additions that is made to the book of Daniel. And the story goes, okay, you've got this Jewish community living in the midst of a Gentile world, but this happens to be an internal kind of story. And there's this wonderful, beautiful woman named Susanna. She's married, of course. She's upright. She follows the law perfectly. And it so happens that every day at the same time, she goes to take a bath in her garden. Well, there are these two Jewish elders that are peeping Toms, basically. And they're looking through the hedges, while she's taking her bath. And they're so overcome with lust for this woman, and they both know they want this woman. They say, well, let's conspire together and let's get her to have sex with us. And they both try, while she's taking the bath, to go in and enforce themselves upon her. Hey, you better do this because we're the elders of the community. Who are they going to believe? Some 19-year-old woman or us, the keepers of the gate, so to speak. So you better do that. And she maintains her purity. She follows this law of not committing adultery. And it does come to pass. The elders come and say, hey, we saw this woman the other day, both of us. So they got two witnesses, saw this woman having sex with another man in her own garden. And of course, Susanna is brought before the council and is in danger of being stoned, right? And she has no recourse because there are two witnesses, speaking out against her. In comes Daniel, right? Daniel, who means judge of God. Daniel, the arbitrator, the one who brings wisdom to the world based upon his upstanding virtue. He says, hold on a minute now. So you say you saw her having sex. Here's what I want you to do. This elder, I want you to go over here. This elder, I want you to go over here. This, by the way, this is how police interview people in crime situations, right? Let's get their stories, see if they match up. So he goes to this elder and says, okay, so you say you saw her having sex under a tree. What kind of tree was that? It was an acacia tree. Goes over to this guy, what kind of tree was it over there? I believe it was an oak tree. And thus he reveals to them that they're the liars, right? They can't get their story straight. And they are the ones who are set before the community and punished severely as a result. But the moral of the story, virtue wins out. Virtue wins out. How do you maintain your virtue? You follow the law that is established. And look at all the committing adultery, not lying, bearing false witnesses, all of those basic, Old Testament 10 Commandments, all of those come to bear in this story. So that's a story called Susanna and the Elders. Now, Jen DeLeschi, as I said, painted this several times. Here's another version of hers on the left. And thankfully, there are no children in the room, so we can actually look at new paintings. But I'm completely blown away by this guy, Thomas Hart Benton, who's from Kansas City, you probably know, a muralist during the 1930s. He has painted this, Susanna and the Elders, in a new context, right? In the American context. You got this old jalopy truck, you got these two farmers here, and here's Susanna about to take her afternoon bath. It's a universal story. It's a fable of righteousness that happens. So any questions? Go ahead, Will.
Well, Benton has paintings in the state capitol in Jefferson City.
Right, as
In
well
the
as
state
the Nelson
capitol
down in Kansas City. If you go to the Nelson Atkins Museum there,
Yeah.
Beautiful. Now I want to just read you this story because, well, I'll just read you one of the stories. But there are other additions to Daniel. One of those is called Bel and the Dragon. There's a dragon reference, okay, in the Bible. It has two morality tales in it. The first one, Daniel is talking to the king, and this time it's the king of Persia. And the king is asking him, hey, why don't you worship our great gods? And Daniel says, because they don't exist. And the king says, oh, yes, they do. Every day I take food over to the temple. I take 2 oxen and 2 sheep and all of this grain over to the temple, and it's gone the next morning. So you can kind of see the silliness of this, right? A lot of these stories have to do with kind of pointing out how silly these other cultures are. Daniel says, let's go over to that temple and see what happens. So they go to the temple, and it doesn't say what God they're referring to here, but they go to the priests and they say, the king says, hey, my friend Daniel here says our God doesn't exist. Oh, yes, he does, because we feed him every day, and we take empty baskets out of here right and left, right? And I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll put the food in the temple, and then we'll lock all the doors. And then in the morning, when you come back, if the food is gone, then you have to kill Daniel. But if the food is still there, then you can kill us. Daniel says, okay, good. And then the priests leave. Daniel says, wait a minute, before we go, here's what I'd like to do. I want to sprinkle some ash around the floor, of where this food is going to be. Next morning, they come in, the king locks the door, seals it with a signet ring. Next morning comes in, the door is, completely sealed. They walk in, the king says, oh, look, the food is gone. Daniel says, hey, let's look at all these footprints around here. I see men's footprints, women's footprints, and children's footprints. And apparently what the story reveals is that there was this trap door that the priests, and they should have known at this time priests were big, kind of portly characters, because they did precisely this, right? They ate the sacrifices. They found the trap door, the priests were revealed, and of course Daniel comes out being the paragon of virtue once again. But also very wise, right? And that's why I like the fact that I'm named after him. So let me just read. It's about 14 verses long, but this is the story about Daniel killing the dragon. It's called Bel and the Dragon. Now in that place, there was a great dragon, which the Babylonians revered. The king said to Daniel, again, the silliness of this, we know dragons don't exist, right? But these Gentile cultures, they're just not right. They believe in these things. The king said to Daniel, you cannot deny that this is a living God, so worship him. Daniel said, I worship the Lord my God, for he is the living God. But give me permission, O king, and I will kill the dragon without sword or club. The king said, I give you permission. And Daniel took pitch, fat, and hair and boiled them together and made cakes, which he fed to the dragon. Which he fed to the dragon. The dragon are them. Oh, the dragon ate them. I have a typo in my Bible. The dragon ate them and burst open. Then Daniel said, see what you have been worshiping. This obviously not a god. When the Babylonians heard about it, they were very indignant and conspired against the king, saying, the king has become a Jew. He has destroyed Bel and killed the dragon and slaughtered the priests. Going to the king, they said, hand Daniel over to us, or else we will kill you and your household. The king saw that they were pressing him hard, and under compulsion, he handed Daniel over to them. And thereafter comes the story of Daniel in the lion's den. So obviously the story of Daniel in the lion's den is molded to meet certain whatever circumstances are necessary. So questions about this. Do you see how these stories mostly almost having a children's aspect to them? Questions about this? Well, then let's move on. Well, we have a lot to do in 15 minutes here. There's a story in the book of Ruth. Also another story written at this time during the intertestamental period, roughly from 500 BCE to 100 of the Common Era. And the story is told in kind of fable fashion. This woman by the name of Naomi marries a Moabite man. And Moab was a region on the other side of the Dead Sea. And so she goes and lives with this Moabite man. They have two sons. The sons get married. And one of the women, well, the women that they married are named Orpah, O-R-P-A-H, which, by the way, is where Oprah Winfrey got her name. It's just her mom misspelled it. Orpah, which means to turn your back, by the way. So it obviously is a symbolic name. And Ruth, which means companion or friend. The husband of Naomi dies. The husbands of these two women die. And they are left, without a household. If you don't have a man to whom you're associated, then you're basically on your own. You're homeless. So Naomi says, you guys, you go back to your families. I'm going to go back to the tribe of Judah, where I'm from. And Orpah says, okay, I'm out of here. See you later. I'm going back. But Ruth, being the virtuous woman that she was, knowing that she had been taken into this family, knew her obligation. She said, no, I'm going to go where you go. You are the person that I follow. And this is that. Let me see if I can find it very quickly. This is that section of Ruth that's often read at weddings. You probably know about it. Do not press me to leave you or turn back from following you. Ruth speaking to Naomi. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die. There I will be buried. May the Lord do this, and so to me, and more as well, if even death parts me from you. What a beautiful statement of loyalty, of companionship, of friendship. So Naomi is overwhelmed by this loyalty on the part of Ruth. She says, it's not going to be easy. We're going to go back. And I don't know if my relatives are still alive. They go back, and lo and behold, it's the barley harvesting season. And as you know, in the Old Testament, it was required of people harvesting wheat in their fields to allow some of that wheat that falls on the ground to be gleaned by the homeless or those who had not fields. And so Ruth and Naomi are pretty much left to only that. And while she is gleaning wheat, she is noticed in the fields by a man by the name of Boaz. And it turns out that Boaz is a distant relative of Naomi's husband. And way leads on the way. I won't get into the story, but it's a little more complex. But eventually Boaz marries Ruth, and thus the story ends. However, there's this really interesting epilogue that happens at the end of the story. Let's see. The women of the neighborhood gave him a name. Well, let me see. Where should I start? Ruth has a son, and they name him Obed. And Naomi, of course, is the nursemaid of Obed. So Ruth and Boaz have a son together. And here's the epilogue of the story. Now, these are the descendants of Perez. Perez became the father of Hezron, Hezron of Ram, Ram of Ammoniah, Ammoniah of Nashdod, Nashdod on and on, Salmon of Boaz, right? Boaz of Obed, Obed of Jesse, and Jesse of David. So Obed, the offspring of Boaz, this good Jewish man, and Ruth over here, not Jewish, Gentile, but nevertheless showing the passion, showing the loyalty, the faithfulness that any good Jew would show. The marriage of that Jew and Gentile leads to the offspring of David down the line. So it's another different type of morality tale, probably promulgated by the more progressive Jews, right? Hey, you really want to separate yourself from these Gentiles? They're not that bad. In fact, if we look at the whole ancestry of David, David was an offspring of a Gentile, well, grandmother, I might say. Obed was his grandfather, Jesse was his father, and then of course, David. So it was a tale that was told. Now it's placed right after Judges, you know, in the Old Testament, because it's supposed to take place during the time of the Judges. But it was most likely written, and actually scholars aren't clear on this. They're kind of fight over it, but obviously I'm taking the position that was written during the intertestamental period because it makes sense. Why else would you want to write the story if you didn't want to emphasize this epilogue, which kind of stands out as just an add-on to the story, right? But it's the reason the story is written. Don't be so exclusive. Exclusivity does not save you. In fact, sometimes by being more inclusive, we come to save the world in ways that we don't understand. There's a wisdom to the universe that we are not aware of. And sometimes your laws can stand in the way of that wisdom. Questions about Ruth? Oh, we've got so much to do here. 10 minutes. But these are so-called intertestamental books, not often read as a result of our common lectionary. Over 3 years, today you will hear, if Greg chooses to preach on this, a story from the book of Esther. Esther is a conundrum for us. It's a puzzle in many ways. You may know the story. It takes place again between the Babylonian captivity and the time of Jesus, when the Persians were in control, where the Persian king Ahasuerus is the main king in this story. And the story goes, and why is it? Well, first of all, why is it a puzzle? Because throughout the whole story, there's not one mention of God. you would think, Bible without mention of God is, Bible story doesn't seem to make much sense. And is it a morality tale? What it ends up looking like is a revenge fantasy. If you read the book of Esther, it's disturbing to read. It's a revenge fantasy, because what happens, and I'll just go over very briefly, this king Ahasuerus has a queen whose name is eluding me for the moment. And he's having this big feast going on. And he wants the queen to come and join him at the feast. And he sends his eunuchs off to get her. And she says, no, I'm busy. And you don't say that to the king, right? And so all of his advisors say, hey, you can't have a woman talking to you like this, right, man? Because it just upsets the whole apple cart, right? You can't have a woman talking to you because it makes you look weak. Again, and this is kind of a Jewish theme running throughout the Old Testament. The sense that if you give a woman too much control, she is going to, you think of Jezebel in 1 Samuel. I'm trying to figure, in Kings, Jezebel. But as a result of this, the queen is shunted aside and the king is looking for a new queen. So he sends out, it's like a Cinderella story, he sends out into his kingdom looking for the most beautiful woman. And lo and behold, this Jewish woman, Esther, which means star, and actually it's connected with the name Ishtar, which is a Babylonian goddess. Esther is chosen as the king's new queen, but she has an uncle by the name of Mordecai, and Mordecai says, don't let him know that we're Jewish. Okay, now, why would that be the case? Now you've got this group of people who want to be exclusively Jewish, but in this story, don't let him know you're Jewish. Well, the king also has an advisor by the name of Haman. And Haman was an Amalekite who was one of the traditional enemies of the Jews. And he hated the Jews. And so he convinces the king, hey, we need to get rid of these Jews. This is a very prescient story, by the way. Reading it is almost painful after World War II for several reasons that you'll soon find out. We need to get rid of these Jews. I'm going to send out, with your leave, I'm going to send out an edict, king, to all of the regions saying that on this particular day, at the end of the year, around September, well, I can't, Nisan is the month in the Jewish calendar. It's the time in which Purim, the Jewish holiday of Purim, is now celebrated. Actually, it's more in February, March. Anyway, this particular time of the year, the Jews are going to be free game for anybody. And naturally, Mordecai and Esther find out about this. And Esther finds a way to convince the king that, this is not good, simply because, well, her uncle Mordecai actually served the king by foiling an assassination plot. And Esther reveals herself to be a Jew and also reveals the plot to be completely misguided. Haman is all ready to exterminate the Jews. He's even built gallows so that he can hang Mordecai, her uncle, and then the tables turn. And the king says, okay, what I'm going to do now, Esther, I'm going to make that day a day where the Jews can have revenge on their enemies. Throughout all of the landscape, they can go and kill those who have been persecuting them. So the Jews do this for 2 days, and on the 3rd day they rest, of course. One of the numbers that is given is 75,000 in one region, 5,000 here, 15,000 here, and it's a slaughter. Okay, are you aware of this book in the Bible? Because it doesn't read very well. But the outcome of this is that this is a celebration that's celebrated by the Jews every spring, called Purim. And it's actually kind of I don't want to say a silly holiday, but it's a holiday for kids. There are little 3-cornered cookies or pastries that are made called Hamantaschen, Haman's hat. And the story is read, and every time Haman's name is mentioned, they go boo. Every time Esther's name is mentioned, they go yay, things like that. It's kind of a fun story, but no mention of God. And then you've got this terrible slaughter that takes place on the part of the Jews, right? They were going to kill us. How completely misguided that was, how completely immoral. But it's okay when we can go and kill them. It's a very difficult story to read. So for that reason, I doubt that Greg will speak to it today. But it is part of our lectionary for today. So our time is upon us, but are there any quick questions or, sorry, I'm going through all this very quickly. I will conclude by saying what we've talked about today is not wisdom literature per se. It just happens to have been written at the time some of the wisdom books were being written. And so it is reflective of the experience of the Jews in this so-called intertestamental period. When we come back on next Sunday, I'll talk a little bit about Jonah, which is another one of these texts, these moral fables, you might say, and spend most of our time looking at Ecclesiastes and the book of Job, which will bring us back into the wisdom literature. And Job is a part of the lectionary for next week. So thank you, everyone. And our
Thank you.
you don't need class.
See you and get to talk a little bit. Now, I just think that so south of Milford, the road is blacktop.
Yes.
And I'm trying to think right where the blacktop is that close to the church?